Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to do the second instalment of my summer book reviews, where I am slowly but surely 5 books at a time taking you through all the books I've read in July and August of this year. I do apologise for a bit of a mess behind me. I am packing to go home later on today, and just quite frankly, I did not want to have to put everything in some other location, so it's staying put. But without much further ado, let's just run through these next 5 books. First up we have Totally Chaotic History, Ancient Egypt Gets Unruly by Greg Jenner. This is a fun little children's history book, very reminiscent of things like Horrible Histories, and the first in a series, this one obviously being about ancient Egypt, but being pitched towards young children to get them more engaged with the past and potentially explore a new interest in history. And there's no one better poised to write this book than Greg Jenner, who is a prominent public historian. You may know him as the host of You're Dead to Me podcast, but he was also a historical consultant and writer on Horrible Histories in its early seasons. He has written adult history books, but has been branching out into children's recently, and as I say, this is the start of a new series. The next book will be on the Romans, and I just love how this book is presented in such a fun, informative way for kids to learn from and enjoy. It's written in a manner that is very easy to follow, quite chatty, with lots of jokes peppered in there and some quite gross moments too, but ones which children will obviously enjoy. Its illustrations add another level to this book to make it even more engaging and informative. The history is chronological, going back 7,000 years ago, and we do skip certain sections that are deemed to be not very interesting, going from the pre-dynastic era up to the Romans, each chapter focusing on a different period of Egyptian history, with a handy little "you are here" meter so you can kind of place yourself through the time, as well as a chaos meter so you can kind of predict how calm or chaotic that period of history was. Alongside Greg Jenner is Dr. Campbell Price, who is curator of Egypt and Sudan at the Manchester Museum, who throughout the book will add little accuracy alarms and help Greg to fact check any prevalent myths or misunderstandings that people may have about ancient Egypt, whether it is these accuracy alarms or little scribbles in the margins. And yeah, this was a really fun, engaging read. Next up, for something that is still on the history track but a little bit different, we have Museum Bums, a cheeky look at butts in art by Mark Small and Jack Shoulder. Is YouTube going to demonetize this video for this? I don't know. This is something that I picked up on the booktuber book crawl back in East London a few months ago, and you know, me being my typical immature self, I was parading around just like, look what I found! And this is basically a history of bums in art, in statues, what our attitude to these statues says about attitudes in society, to sex and sexuality, to art, to the body, what is desirable, going from thousands of years ago to the present day. I'm glad to have read this. I do think it is a really fun book, but I think works a lot better just as a coffee table image book than anything else. I would say the writing in here, while it is, you know, quite informative, is a little bit scatty, a little bit unfocused at times, kind of jumping from one topic to another. I didn't necessarily like how the chapters were laid out in here. I didn't really think there was much rhyme or reason for talking about the certain things, at least in the placements that they were put. But this all being said, the writing takes up a very small part of this book, and it is majority images, which I think is exactly what most people are wanting to read this book for. So yeah, if you are an art historian, this may appeal to you, though unless you are just wanting a little bit of a cheeky history to have on your coffee table, I'm not sure who else this would necessarily appeal to. Next up is a slightly different read for me. A friend of mine recently lent me Strange Sally Diamond by Liz Nugent, which is more of a thriller, mystery kind of book, one that I know got very popular on BookTube and BookShock, and I'd seen floating around but had never put much interest in, but she lent it to me and I thought, you know what, let's give this a go, and this was a very interesting read. So the premise that a lot of people talk about is the opening of this book, which sees Sally noting that her father has died. Sally was very sheltered by her father, does not necessarily pick up on social cues, can often take things very literally, and so when her father had always said that if he were to die he should be put out with the bins, she basically does just that, incinerating his body and putting it in a bin bag, and doesn't necessarily understand why everybody is very upset about this, and questioning what this means about Sally herself and her potential complicity in his death. For the first time in her life, Sally is having a lot of attention on her. A lot of people in her community that she's never met before are coming up to her. People are taking an interest, and so slowly but surely more things are unravelling about her life, particularly following letters that her father had left for her to read following his death. And what is revealed throughout this book is a really dark, traumatic past which Sally has no remembrance of. And as you go on to read, it's quite understandably so that her child brain would want to forget this trauma. What I will say for this is I can completely understand why this had the hype that it did. It is definitely a dark, compelling book that leaves you wanting to know more. I think Liz Nugent is very skilled at writing in a compelling way. This being said, I'm not a thriller reader, and I don't necessarily know what this book is offering that other books do not already do in that genre. I feel like if you read a lot of thrillers, you'd probably predict where the plot is going quite early on. Also to say that while Liz Nugent is really skilled in building up these characters, building up a past for them, them, I feel like as she goes further on in the story, she kind of puts herself in a bit of a tangle and doesn't really know how to resolve this story, especially as we start to see another point of view character come in and seeing about their history, which is quite frankly not as compelling to read about as Sally's, and ends up meaning that we have an ending, a conclusion that is actually quite unsatisfactory for the story that had built up over time, particularly of Sally starting to build up her confidence socially, starting to make friends. And it feels like by the time we get to the end of the book, through the different circumstances and the different situations that she's gotten herself into, she's right back at the beginning. So it kind of feels like you get to the end of the book, have gone through so much story only to be right back at the beginning with very little development. So yeah, very engaging to read, but maybe didn't quite stick the landing for me. However, the last two books I want to talk to you about today are both historical fiction, and it definitely lived up to the hype that I had built up for them in my brain. The first of those being The King's Mother by Annie Garthwaite. This is the second book following her debut Cecily, which was all about the first half of the life of Cecily Neville, who was mother to two kings, who was wife to Richard, Duke of York, who would go on to challenge the reign of Henry VI, and it would be his son Edward who would go on to defeat him and become Edward IV. But then following Edward's death, his brother Richard would go on to usurp the throne from his sons and become Richard III. In the middle of all of this, we have their mother, Cecily Neville, and this book is tracking that second half of her life after Edward has taken the throne, and how Cecily is navigating court and her new position of prominence, the relative safety that being so close to the king can put you in, but also the precarity of that situation, and the fact that there are always other people who have their eyes on the prize and have their eyes on power. The king's mother relating not just to Cecily herself, but to other people who are competing to become the wife or the mother to a future king, such as Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, who has her own son that she's fighting for the interests of, Elizabeth Woodville, who comes up in this book, who ends up unexpectedly becoming the wife of Cecily's son Edward, which is incredibly contentious and controversial for this court, or indeed Margaret Beaufort, whose son Henry Tudor we know is always going to be a potential threat. And as a follow-up to Cecily, I really enjoyed this. There are a lot of comparisons to Annie Garthwaite's writing and Hilary Mantel's, and I can definitely see why. There is so much historical detail in here. It is incredibly atmospheric, and I love being able to return to the late medieval court through Cecily's eyes. We've also got this character who is quite scheming, who you can definitely sympathise with, but is not always the most morally great person, particularly towards the end of the book. She is definitely quite manipulative in her way, and especially towards the end of the book. Depending on your views on Cecily Neville, and especially Richard III, you could see her as a villain or a hero, someone completely in the right, or someone who is ruthless in order to get her way. And of course, with a historic figure who is so close to Richard III, she is obviously very sympathetic to her son, wants to see him staying on the throne, with all that it implies when it comes to any of the controversies associated with Richard III. And while I may not necessarily agree with some of the conclusions that Annie Garthwaite, or at the very least Cecily Neville, comes to when it comes to her son, I can appreciate at least that it is consistent in her characterisation. I'm very sorry, Ricardians, but I am personally of the belief that he did order for the two princes in the tower to be executed. I just don't see another way. People put up their theories of who else could have done it, and I can't see it. And that is definitely not the tack that this book is going with. Richard is definitely a sympathetic figure in here, and with Annie Garthwaite's writing, you can kind of be convinced along that way of thinking. It wouldn't seem consistent with the characterisation of Richard in here for him to do that. In fact, Richard's characterisation in this book was probably second favourite of mine to Cecily's, but I still feel that even with that narrative being used, I feel like Annie Garthwaite is still very even-handed in her depictions of all of the major players in the Wars of the Roses. You know, it's not putting Richard and Cecily on a pedestal in order to put down Henry Tudor or Margaret Beaufort. I still feel like they are written with a lot of respect. And I think especially after recently having read quite a lot of historical fiction, particularly royal court historical fiction, where the authors are definitely trying to come down on one side and rise up one person over another, I really appreciated the even-handedness of Annie Garthwaite in this book. While I don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions, I can still respect them and feel like they are still fair. So yeah, I was so glad to read this one. Definitely lived up to the hype for me. And then finally, had to talk about The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery, Hurst by Katie Lumsden. If I had to pick a favourite, it would be this one. But of course, this was always going to appeal to me. Very clearly written as a love letter to the novels of Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell. In this book, we are looking at the goings-on of this county of Wickenshire and how they are absolutely rocked with the discovery that one of their most eligible bachelors, Mr Montgomery Hurst, is getting married to someone that they do not know. Not only a complete stranger, but also a widow who has children, and everyone questioning why on earth would he have picked her her, particularly when he always seemed so set on one of their own, Miss Amelia Ashpoint. But Amelia herself, who is to all extents and purposes our main character, though this is definitely a very community-led story with lots of different POVs, she doesn't seem to be particularly bothered by this change in her fortune. Through the course of this story, we get to hear more about Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, but from the perspectives of all of the people gossiping about them. We very rarely get to spend a lot of time within their minds, and instead in a style that is so reminiscent of something like Cranford, it is a little slice of life built up by rumours through gossip, until you're getting a picture not just of this married couple, but also this entire community, and how they work together and sometimes work against each other. What I loved about this is you're kind of getting the opportunity to read about the individual voices within a Greek chorus, but in this case that being this little gossipy counties version of the ton, this little microcosm of a society with all different levels within it, which can at sometimes act as a collective, acting as one, but you're also getting to see the individual voices within that. What drives each of these characters, why they act the way that they do, what secrets are lurking behind them, ways in which that they appear to everyone else to be one kind of person, but we know, because we're getting to spend more time with them, actually what's unfolding in their own life and motivating their behaviour. Characters that we may have written off in a previous chapter as being no good suddenly become three-dimensional, multifaceted characters because we get to have their perspective. But saying all that, though we get to have these individual voices, when this community do come together as a collective, and particularly when they want to pounce on someone as a result of the gossip they've heard, this town, this community, its atmosphere can be stifling. And I feel like Katie was able to really capture that well. When everyone is looking for their next scandal, you better hope that you are not the target. For me, this was just testament to how great Katie is at writing well-defined characters who all are very distinct, who are all three-dimensional in their own way. Yes, we do have certain characters who are, to all intents and purposes, the villain, but they do get their little moments here or there to be more than that. We have people that we're rooting for, but even Amelia, who, as I say, to all intents and purposes, is our main character, she is definitely not a perfect character. There are definitely things that you can criticise her for, and the narrative does criticise her for. And through the course of the book, we get to see her grow and change. And yeah, I really enjoyed this. And safe to say, our very own Katie at Books and Things is becoming one of my favourite historical fiction writers, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing whatever she writes next. So there we go, that was my next 5 books for summer. Do let me know if you've read any of the books that I've spoken to you about today. Alternatively, please let me know if any recommendations that you have from your summer reading. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.